All right. For those who might not know me, my name is Ian Siegel. I am the CEO and founder of Streamline Learning, the author of School Sucks, Your Child Doesn't, and the creator of the iSavant assessment. In today's presentation, Dr. McMahon and I will be providing you with concrete neuroscience-backed advice on how to liberate over a quarter of families across the world from environmental factors impeding their brilliance. And Jen here will be talking about the research we're doing to take our understanding further. We'll be discussing, one, the recipe for brilliance based on recent breakthroughs in neuroscience and medicine. Two, the relationship between insecurity, learning, and genius that exists today. Three, how to change your environment to make accessing your brilliance possible. And four, how to change your response to your environment to take full advantage of the transformation in your neurology. And again, I want to forewarn you that this presentation will likely surprise you. And if you're like me, you'll fight like hell against what we'll be sharing with you. It took me years to figure this out for myself, delaying my recovery from a chronic illness and delaying the awakening of my own brilliance. In fact, if you want to go full tragic hero, it may feel like Odysseus' journey in the Odyssey, where your instinct is to defy the gods based on what you already know. So we're going to do the best we can to help you avoid the tragic heroism that I fell into and help you see a path home to the brilliant person you've been all along, so you can pave that path for your child. This next slide is meant to illustrate you should listen to me, but I want to reframe the information here in a way that you're not expecting. Just to be clear, 15,000 hours is a shitload of tutoring time across a decade. And sure, I've hit the 10,000 hour mark that makes you an expert. But the reason I think you should listen to me today is not because I've tutored so much, or why I've tutored so much. For the vast majority of my life, I had a chronic illness, and over the past decade, it had gotten increasingly worse, to the point that my life was confined to very little, and tutoring became my only escape. Ultimately, I almost died trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And the experience not only transformed my life, but gave me an incredible insight into brilliance and disease that has changed my understanding of learning in a way I'd never expect. Since then, I've had a very unique set of experiences that have given me rare insight into the building blocks of genius and the steps that can be taken to unlock that genius for a sizable portion of the population. For most people, the closest they've been to seeing genius has been watching the movie Good Will Hunting. How many folks have seen that movie? Maybe show of hands. Okay, great. Well, for those who have, we're going to be using that movie as a framework. And we're going to see the world through Matt Damon's character's Will's eyes to help everyone here move past the idea that genius is magic and start to understand the foundational elements of the most advanced technology on Earth, geniuses. First things first, let's talk apples. In terms of best apples out there, you guys might say Honeycrisp, but for me, the best apple I've ever had is a Pink Lady apple. They're incredible. They taste like Sour Patch Kids. They also last forever on the shelf. To me, they're the genius of apples. And for centuries, people have eaten apples and have perfected grafting apple varieties that we like to ensure that we can produce the best apples year after year. Thousands of years ago, however, apples were only found in Kazakhstan, where they first proliferated in the wild. Yes, where Borat's from. Most of the apples you found there tasted like crap, and any good qualities about apples were completely random. Since then, we've seen apple trees as technology that can be improved in order to produce the best apples. My hope is by the end of this presentation that you'll see that genius among humans can be seen in the same light, that it shouldn't be 1 in a million. In fact, the reason it is results from us not knowing what variables count. Because based on what I now understand, manufacturing genius isn't just possible with Pink Lady apple trees. It's possible with at least a quarter of the human population. And I picked this audience very intentionally, starting with you. Because again, I just have to say, I am convinced that everyone I know is smarter than me. And I'm here to prove it to you. Before we unpack that reality, let's first establish what learning is on a neurological level and contrast it with the screwed up implications of learning that happens today. Once upon a time, learning and survival weren't just inextricably linked, they involved man and woman and were the basis of our evolutionary niche. Imagine a caveman couple in a cave, the woman pregnant with a child. In that cave, imagine the following scenario that involves survival and learning. Woman, the human whose faculties of perception tend to be more acute, hears a saber-toothed tiger in the underbrush outside of the cave and rustles awake. Man, not as attuned to external stimuli, but very attuned to the predisposition of the woman next to him, stirs awake. Man grabs his spear and hides beside the entry of the cave, fear and hostility building in his body. And when the saber-toothed tiger enters, the man thrusts his spear through the neck of the beast. By killing it, he protects himself and the cave woman inside and their baby, using targeted aggression as a form of defense. The couple's fear dissipates. They cook the flesh of the tiger. The nutrients the mother consumes aren't the only gifts passed on to the next generation. Especially if this threatening episode happened in previous generations, the spaced repetition of this experience across generations means the child gets access to this knowledge base on a subconscious level, epigenetically, helping the child better survive in the future. Now let's use this story to illustrate the process of learning that occurs in the brain for an individual, using each character in the story to illustrate the function of some major structures in the brain. I'll give you 30 seconds just to check out this slide, give you a sense of how the brain works. All right, let's dive in. Notice how the process of learning reflects the scientific method. Perceptual stimulus causes our right hemisphere to guess what we think we're perceiving, because our conscious reality is a guess based on what we already know. Milliseconds later, the left hemisphere is woken up to check if our conscious guess is accurate. New learning is integrated into our hippocampus in our temporal lobe, where it can be drawn upon in the future, not just during your brain's lifetime, but during the lifetime of family members that inherit this memory subconsciously. As you can see in this slide, the brain takes on personified qualities that require healthy communication across its different parts to make learning possible. And as you'll see in the next slide, learning today looks a lot different. As it always has for mammals, learning starts before birth. The psychological and physical state of the mother during pregnancy has dramatic implications on the physical and psychological state of the child. The norm in today's world is to live in a state of stress and insecurity. Parents, at no fault of their own, worry about their children before they're born and cling to benchmarks of standards to mitigate their anxieties. When babies are born, they focus on what their parents focus on. Doing so is a source of affirmation for the baby and part of the adaptive mechanism of the brain that helps us survive. When parents are stressed by their expectations for their child, children absorb the underlying feelings of insecurity and learn to judge themselves. They understand what is acceptable and what is not, and learn to neglect or reject parts of themselves in order to feel accepted. The greater the neurological capacities of parents and children, and I see this all the time, the more vulnerable they are to fall into this pattern of incessant self-judgment and concern. All of these forces can get much worse in school, where students really feel judged by how easily knowledge comes to them, rather than their ability to recognize, reconcile, and integrate new frameworks of seeing the world. Over time, children and adults develop entire personalities in response to these stressors and develop a fundamentally defensive stance toward learning, impeding them from accessing the subconscious frameworks they were gifted with. So they're gifted and yet not accessing those gifts. Worse still, they lose their ability to interact with the unknown, what I call authentic learning. This is why when talking about genius and manufacturing genius, we got to put school aside. After all, the genius Will from the movie Good Will Hunting is very clear about the fact that you do not need to go to school or go to college to fulfill your genius. All that information that you learn there, it's already in the public library. It's shit we already know. Rather than teaching students how to learn and engage with the unknown, school can alienate students for not knowing what everyone else already knows. So let's back up and talk about the variables that do impact genius and learning. Well, grounded in Will's experience in Good Will Hunting and my unique window into genius as a tutor over the past decade. The most obvious reality about genius from the outside is how everything comes to them with ease. There's no thinking. There's just knowing. For the outside observer, they're magic. That's what it feels like when you watch Matt Damon's character, Will, read or solve abstract math problems in Good Will Hunting. But Will's genius is far from the only form. There are memory champions, creative geniuses, brilliant storytellers, scientists, leaders, and organizers. Regardless of the specific manifestation, let's use our current understanding of neuroscience to unpack what's really going on behind the magic. With family epigenetics, it's a big one. On the surface, it might seem like reading that fast, like Will is doing here, is a product of supernatural processing speed. But really, it's about expectations, anticipation, and framework someone brings to whatever they're reading. It's well documented that the more you read about a topic, the faster you read when you read about that topic. Why? There's less to wrestle with. You pretty much know what an author will say, and you're just confirming what you already know. So it's important to understand that Will is not authentically learning when he's reading here. He's confirming at some level what is already in his brain on a subconscious level. Where does this subconscious framework come from? It's not just about what you learned during your lifetime. It also has to do with your parents, parents, their parents, and so on. Specifically, we inherit what our ancestors mastered, the kind of learning that becomes part of people, and therefore part of the epigenetics they pass down to their children and children's children. I talk about this in my book, but I remember when I was tutoring in Palo Alto right after college, and after a year of working for a high-end shop, I was matched with a 7-year-old who was said to be a genius. His name was Chen. Chen's dad was a Harvard alum, summa cum laude in physics, and introduced himself as such when we first met. I quickly decided Chen's dad was not a genius in terms of emotional intelligence, and later discovered that, like his son, he was mildly autistic. But Chen's dad was also right. When I watched Chen read just as fast as Matt Damon's character in Good Will Hunting, my jaw dropped. Now I know how his pace of reading had to do a lot with how much his mother and father had learned, and their parents had learned, and their parents' parents, and so on. Learning is a family thing. The more your family learns all the way to mastery, the more you pave the way for your children and your children's children to prove what you already know. The next factor contributing to genius has to do with changing the dynamics between the hemispheres of our brains. The left hemisphere of our brains plays a vital role in moderating our perception of and response to external stimuli. These functions are important in survival situations when the brain's energy is dedicated to reacting to survive. Under chronic stress, however, the overstimulation of the left hemisphere limits our perceptions to what we already know. It impedes our ability to think from multiple perspectives, and it reinforces patterns of rumination and self-judgment. The diseases listed on this slide dramatically impair the left hemisphere's ability to carry out these functions, liberating the right hemisphere and often recruiting that side of the brain for functions normally carried out by the left. All of these diseases are associated with HLA genes on chromosome 6. All have to do with immune function, our fundamental learning system that exists within us. And what I'm saying is all of these HLA types, whether they have to do with what Dr. McMahon will talk about with toxin exposure, or the HLA genes outside those that have to do with dyslexia, autism, and there's crossover over both groups, that all these genes also have to do with brilliance. And I see backwards math from specific psychological and learning disabilities to the specific forms of brilliance that kids bring to the table. And it's obvious through tutoring. The point is, as long as the right hemisphere isn't in an active state of stress, this change in neurology, where your right hemisphere is liberated, can come with some impressive cognitive abilities. Indeed, the individuals listed here all possessed or possess the special minds. But they also struggle with the alienation that comes with their lack of control around moderating their own behavior. Especially within a society that is normalized and judgmental, these individuals often themselves on the outside looking in. And as far as authentic learning goes, this alienation gives these individuals a unique insight into the inner workings of our world. Isolated from the conformity of the crowd, they're able to make and integrate new insights that can change the world. The challenge is whether mainstream society accepts that learning, especially in the geniuses' lifetimes. Many geniuses in modern times have lived miserable, lonely lives and are only recognized, if at all, long after their deaths. And again, easy example, Elon Musk, helping us save the world, but we focus on how he's a social buffoon. Let's keep going. Now, there's another group of individuals whose genius is more powerful than the genius of those named thus far, but whose genius is left untapped. These are all the individuals who deal with chronic anxiety. More than any other group, they're in a constant state of insecurity about what we as human beings already know. This means that their left hemisphere isn't just impaired, it's constantly activated. You know that inner voice planning and worrying in your head? That's what it is. Anxiety impedes access to your subconscious frameworks, scrambles basic cognitive processes, and undermines your ability to communicate and connect with others. On the SAT, in life skills, and with any form of authentic learning, these individuals tend to be the slowest learners and furthest from their genius potential because they have the most potential and yet the greatest impediments. We'll discuss how to unlock that potential in the next section. More than any other group, the potential impact on them is extraordinary. The crucial point is, beyond everything I've mentioned so far, across all of these groups, genius doesn't transpire if the right hemisphere is actively under attack. Not only does it need to be free from the white-knuckled grip of a stressed left hemisphere, it must be free of stressors, period. An inflamed brain can't learn. Indeed, when genius brains are in an inflamed state, people stop acting like geniuses entirely. With added stress, mild versions of each one of those conditions can become extreme. And in those cases, the most promising among us can become impossible as our behaviors become increasingly antisocial and our ability to think from others' perspectives vanishes. And while there are many external factors that can put the brain in an inflamed state, including being an orphan like Will, the most consequential and widespread happen to be the ones that we are least aware of. More than bullying or even a school shooter, the most pernicious challenges involve physiological realities. And these are the crazy ones, and this is what Dr. McMahon will talk about. Biotoxins from bacteria that thrive in indoor spaces, over half of houses, almost every school. Biotoxins from COVID that cause long COVID, and biotoxins from random sources like spider bites and Lyme disease and all that good stuff. Regardless of the source, geniuses simply can't deal with their toxic neurological environment under stress. Not if they want to retain their genius. They need to treat themselves like geniuses. And this, corny as it sounds, is a lesson in unconditional love. Let's say you have the epigenetic knowledge base. You have the screwed up left hemisphere and your right hemisphere is liberated. Let's say all that's true. Again, corny. So I'm going to say it my way. None of those factors mean shit without unconditional love. A study of individuals with savant syndrome, those twice exceptional people who possess immense talents and challenges simultaneously, reveal time and again that the savant never surfaces without at least one person in their lives who unconditionally accepts them, knows the good and the bad, and loves them. This is true with every genius. Everyone knows that if a baby isn't held early on in life, that baby will die. But few know why. At that point in a baby's life, their left hemisphere is far from being fully developed. Genius can't survive on its own. It needs a support network, whether that neural network is part of them or a parent or a friend. When you're an adult, you might be able to survive without unconditional love, but your genius can't. Without unconditional love, your mind will revert to focusing on yourself, on your insecurities, and you won't be you. You won't be able to observe the outside world for what it is. Without loving yourself, you won't be able to love the outside world enough to truly know it. You'll be a slave to something else. And if that's been the case, like for me, that's okay too. You can find your way back to the genius you've been all along. Let's talk about how. The first step to unlocking your inner savant is to let go. This is challenging because this involves excising ourselves from a vicious cycle. For us anxious people, especially, our aversion to loss keeps us from learning when we're in a stress state. So does our aversion to social rejection. We don't want to be seen as foolish, so it's easier to conform to conventional wisdom. If you let them, these forces will limit the impact of this presentation. You'll find ways to diminish the importance of what I'm saying or try to prove me wrong and the medical advice that follows. You'll rationalize everything away, return to the safety of what you think you know. Don't worry. I can empathize with you. I did this for the first 31 years of my life. Here's why. I want you to imagine the last toxic relationship you were in. And if you're like most people and you're in one now, don't worry about using your imagination. Let's consider why you might find yourself in one. Often, you don't realize you're in a toxic relationship. You might not even recognize what a healthy one looks like. 2, you were insecure about yourself at the beginning of the relationship, causing you to ignore the warning signs. Or 3, you're afraid of what you might lose and whether there's anything better for you out there. The reality is most potential geniuses are in a toxic relationship with themselves. And all the same reasons apply. And this is more true for people with chronic anxiety than anyone. So when you hear the medical protocol that Dr. McMahon explains next, expect yourself to feel resistance, to feel dismissive and try to ignore or prove wrong what we explain. You'd sound like me. It's no different than when a good friend tells you that you shouldn't be with the romantic partner you're with. You probably won't like the news and you'll be scrambling for reasons why they're wrong. And trust me, it takes one to know one. Like I said, no one is better than me at ignoring the warning signs. It was only because of my near-death experience that I let go. I was forced to. And on a visceral level, I realized how important this is to learning. Why babies and geniuses like Socrates are the best learners. They know nothing and lead their lives that way. And with knowing nothing and nothing to lose, they can embrace the outside world, even love it, just as it is. That's why the journey to genius is a Shakespearean one. It's what kills me. I was an English major. One where you realize that being an idiot savant is the same thing as being a tragic hero, because you're missing things, because your brain is focusing you on things that you feel better at, while the other stuff too painful. Shakespeare had it right. Waking up is the difference between tragedy and comedy. And this is about letting go of the Iago. For those of you know Othello, the famous play, the guy keeps telling Othello Desdemona's cheating on you. If that Iago's that nonstop self-chatter, I'll discuss next, so that you don't fall prey into the tragedy of Othello, ignoring Iago. So I'm wrapping up here in a second here. Turn it over to Dr. McMahon. So who here has heard of Britney Spears? Everybody. What about polyvagal theory? Very few people. This is the cutting edge of psychology. It's based on the latest understanding, grounded in physiological realities of the brain and the key factors that drive our conscious awareness and emotional state. The point here is that in a non-activated state, you're in a learning state. That's Britney at her best. But by undergoing the medical protocol, you'll become increasingly familiar with this state. With this awareness, you want to pay increasing attention to when you revert to an activated state. This is an essential step in stopping the feedback loop between your favorite survival response and what we call your unconscious ego personality, which is part of my iSavant assessment. This is not easy. If you've been dealing with neuroinflammation your whole life, you've been in an activated state for a long time. In fact, as you learn to observe yourself in this state and begin to cool down by undergoing the protocol that Dr. McMahon will explain, you may experience feelings of remorse and, like me, embarrassment about your behavior in the past. Don't beat yourself up about it. It will only cause more stress, which will make the process of accessing your genius slower. Moreover, don't be surprised that this increased awareness will cause shifts in your relationships with the people closest to you. You may realize that you haven't been as close to them as you may have wanted. And as you naturally try to get closer to them, you may experience resistance. This is normal too, because as you undergo the protocol, you will develop a greater sense of awareness, something that others in your life might not necessarily share. So things that might feel obvious to you won't be that way for others in your life. Moreover, they might not immediately forgive you for your past right away, but don't let that stop you from forgiving yourself or them. You'll want to share what you've learned, but they might not be ready. That's okay. Accepting yourself in the way you've paid tribute to your unconscious ego for so long is the first step to accepting others. Despite having so much potential, most people in your life may be in too much pain to learn or change. That's okay too. They'll get there. Put those people in park while you take your new Ferrari out for a ride. As I say this, you're probably experiencing doubts about, how 25% plus of the population has potential for genius. Or if you accept that, you may doubt that you have one of the HLA types that make you part of the club. Or beyond the ones that are specifically that Dr. McMahon will mention. It's more. You must be, you're thinking. You must be on the outside looking in. It can't be genius. This stuff is normal. Remember, I said at the beginning that this would feel like the Odyssey. Well, the scariest part for anyone on this journey, including me, is coming to grips with the power of who they really are. So I'm going to walk you guys through this part, give you a head start. First, I want you to remember the implications of Socrates' words. Because you know nothing, this is basically it. If you know nothing, you have nothing to lose, right? That's the implication. You have nothing to lose. And remember, we're all just apple trees here, and most of us have only really experienced the equivalent of pruning, the brain damage that, might have made a right hemisphere a little bit more dangerous. But you'll be amazed at what a little sunshine can do. So I know this is a weird exercise, but just, under your breath, just try it out because there's so much charged BS around the word genius. And instead, just say like, the thing I might have been thinking about as a kid, am I a genius? Am I that smart? Maybe it's possibly true. That's what I'm saying. So repeat after me inwardly, saying the simple affirmation, trusting that you'll grow into these shoes. Because this is what happens to my students. I am a genius. Easy. Simple. It's there. For a long time, I saw learning as the first cognitive process that unravels under chronic stress and neuroinflammation. It made perfect sense. Learning is the most complex, sensitive process that our brains accomplish. Of course, it's the first to get majorly fucked up by persistent toxin exposure. But the more tragic observation I made is that something goes offline for the most brilliant among us long before the delicate neurological processes that help us learn. Long before. It's our hearts. Corny, I know, this is not Ian, but I'm telling you, it's our hearts. That's why so many families of geniuses haven't just lost their sense of selves. They've lost track of the authentic connection with one another. I joke about it's like going in and out of the river Leaf, the one that makes you forget to connect. I see it all the time with smart people. They forget why we're here on earth, why we're love and being connected, the good stuff. They lost track of their authentic connection with one another, like my favorite movie, The Royal Tenenbaums. Your family, like my family, might sound a little bit like a family of geniuses that have kind of lost their way a little bit. If this is the case, you're not alone. Through my personal and professional experience, I've realized that we're in a world of broken-hearted geniuses who are just trying to do the right thing. But they've lost sight of the reality that doing the right thing is as simple as following their hearts. Because when you fall in love with the world around you, the people, the animals, the plants in it, it's easy to learn like a genius. The world around you becomes your favorite song, the one you learn by heart. Thank you. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Dr. McMahon to describe the medical protocol that makes this possible.
You're muted.
I'm muted. Hello, my name is Dr. Scott McMahon, and based on what Ian said, I am a genius. Maybe I'm even brilliant. I definitely know I'm smarter than him because he already said it. But seriously, I have been studying mold-based illnesses and specifically chronic inflammatory response syndrome now for about 13 years. I've seen, it says 1,500, it's closer to 2,000 patients. I've written a number of different articles. I've testified in many different court cases and the like, been practicing as a pediatrician for almost 30 years, and I have been practicing for over 30 years. And today I want to tell you about the most common illness that you've probably never heard of. Jen, if you could change the slide. So most people are not aware of this. Many doctors are not aware of this, but 25% of the population of the entire United States, and for that matter, probably for the entire world, have a genetic predisposition for an illness that's called chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's a multi-system illness that affects every part of your body and especially your brain. Now, if 25% of the population have a predisposition to get this, and you have to have an exposure, what percentage of buildings might have the exposure? Well, 50 to 80% of the buildings in the United States, according to the EPA, have water damage. If you have water damage, then you can grow mold. And if you have extra mold and bacteria and actinobacteria, then those can lead to this chronic inflammatory response syndrome, typically found in people that have the genetic predisposition. So again, looking at a population of, I think I used 328 million, that would mean that based on this number of people with a genetic predisposition and this many buildings, 52 million people in the United States are both being exposed and have a genetic predisposition. And that impacts over 11 million children just in the United States. You could get the next slide, Jen. So the impact, what happens when you number one have an HLA or genetic haplotype predisposition, and you are chronically exposed to toxins and inflammagens and microbes that are present in factors of thousands of times more than what are in our normal environment in a water damaged building. What it leads to is a problem in your innate immune system, and your immune system can't regulate itself. The immune system starts to overproduce chemicals that are called cytokines. If you're unfamiliar with cytokines, think about the last time that you had the flu, or if you had COVID and how you felt. It's not the virus itself that's usually causing the symptoms of your illness. It's actually the cytokines that are being overproduced that cause the headaches and the stomach issues and the feeling crummy and the fevers and all that. It's cytokines that do that. Now imagine that your cytokines are running amok like that 24/7, 365, maybe even for years, some people for decades. And another thing that happens to cause this lack of regulation in the immune system is that chemicals called VIP, or vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, and MSH, alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, whose job is to bring a ramped up, activated immune system back down to normal when the immune system no longer needs to fight off an infection. Well, imagine now that you have very low levels of both of these chemicals, and you cannot bring your innate immune system back down to normal. So you stay activated all the time. And not only that, but if you have a low level of MSH, it can do a number of things around your body. For instance, MSH is critical for the way your gut functions, and it keeps the integrity of what are called tight junctions. So when you hear people talking about they have leaky gut, the first thing you should say is, what is your MSH level? Chances are they won't know. But we find that MSH is low in over 93% of our patients. And it leads to leaky gut, food allergies, food sensitivities, and the like. MSH is also critical in a number of other areas of your body. For instance, normal sleep cycles are dependent on an adequate amount of MSH. Frequent urination happens when MSH isn't able to modulate how much antidiuretic hormone you're making. Chronic pain syndromes, low levels of cortisol, which can lead to fatigue, the infection with certain, or colonization with certain types of biofilm forming bacteria, all are as a result of low levels of MSH. And there are a number of other things that can happen. Next slide, please. Is that the next slide? I was expecting a different one.
Is that it?
Back? Well, I'll just do, let's just go back a couple slides.
Oh, well, hold on 1 second.
One more. Oh my goodness. Let's keep going back.
What does it do?
We are going the wrong direction.
It's not, okay, what is it doing?
There we go.
Is this right? There we go. This one? No.
Okay. So we just did this one. That's the one I was expecting.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No problem. So this chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, can affect multiple systems of the body. In small children, maybe it's only one or two, but by the time you become 11 years old, it's already affecting 4, 5 different areas of your body. And there are 3 main mechanisms by which you affect these systems in your body. The first one is that you can get decreased blood flow, or the fancy term is hypoperfusion. But you're not getting adequate blood flow to areas of your body, and they tend to be the peripheral parts, your hands and your feet and your brain. Your brain is a peripheral part of your body. It's not in the core of your body. So imagine what happens if areas of your brain are not getting adequate blood flow, are not able to make adequate energy. They underperform. And within the CIRS world, we've done MR, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, that actually shows that certain areas of the brain in people who suffer from this illness are actually not getting enough blood flow. That's a bad thing. The second thing that can happen has to do with what's called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier forms by the time you're 5 days old. So you don't have it inside your mom, but you do have it once you're 5 days old. And it helps keep a number of different toxins and other chemicals that the brain just doesn't want to be exposed to. It helps keep those out of the brain's blood circulation. However, if you degrade the blood-brain barrier, if you start to get little patches of breaches of the blood-brain barrier, then toxins and these excess cytokines that we talked about before that are being overproduced by your body constantly, they can now get into the brain, and they form or they create a very low level of what we call encephalitis or encephalopathy. More specifically, we call it toxic encephalopathy. And when that happens, your brain doesn't work very well. On top of that, you have in the center of your brain, but right underneath and in the middle of the cerebral hemispheres, you have a little itsy bitsy thing about the size of the nub of your thumb that is called the hypothalamus. And you may never have heard of the hypothalamus, but let me guarantee you, it's heard of you. Your hypothalamus is the main regulatory center of your entire body. It has its little fingers in every pie that your body does. And I'll just mention 3 things that it does. One is it controls your pituitary gland, which controls the majority of your endocrine system. So that's your hormones, and it controls most of your hormones in your body. A second thing that the hypothalamus does is it exerts its control on body-wide settings like hunger, like temperature perception, or what your actual body temperature is, and your sleep cycles. And last but not least, the hypothalamus also controls 2 of your body's 3 nervous systems. And the ones that it controlled, they touch almost every cell of your body. The ones that they control, what's known as the autonomic nervous system, controls how fast your heart beats, how quickly and how deeply you breathe, whether your hairs stand on end, whether your pupils get big, all these things that your body does that you don't even think about, the hypothalamus is controlling. So you can see that the hypothalamus has a global impact on your body. But because of the blood-brain barrier being breached, and because a couple of areas of the hypothalamus are not even covered by the blood-brain barrier, when you have extra cytokines in your body, or if you have certain types of toxins that come from activated molds, you end up getting damage to your hypothalamus. You get inflammation to that too, and it doesn't function properly. So when you put all these things together, what do you think it does to a brain? Well, inflammation it disrupts the normal thinking processes. It makes it difficult to have a good, particularly short-term memory. It makes it very difficult to concentrate, very difficult to learn new information, very difficult to recall words when you're talking. And executive functioning, which is necessary to do such simple things as writing an email, executive functioning just goes out the window. And children who have this chronic low-level inflammation in their brains will underperform. Now, they may still do very well in school, but imagine how well they could have done if they didn't have all of these factors that are messing with their brain. Next slide, please. So you may say, where are all these ill children? I mentioned 11 million children that, are either being exposed, are being exposed and they have the genetic predisposition. Where are all of these people? Well, again, this disease is the most common one that you've never heard of. And studies have shown that 17%, that's 1 out of 6 children in the United States between the ages of 4 and 18 have chronic headaches. And as a pediatrician for 30 years, I can tell you that 30 years ago, we had no idea what was causing this. And 30 years later, we still have no idea what's causing all these children to have these headaches. So what we say is it must be stress. It's probably stress. They have some sort of psychic need and whatnot. And so that manifests as a headache. And yet, when I did studies on my own patients as a practicing pediatrician, what I found was that about 9 out of 10 of these kids had not only the genetic markers for chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but they had multiple biomarkers showing that they had the illness. And when I treated them, they got much better. So this is unpublished data. I'm hoping to publish by the end of the year. Another 10 million children are suffering from chronic stomach issues. And what I was told when I was in residency, and what they're still teaching today, is that this is either a primary gain or a secondary gain from the child. It's a psychological thing. There's nothing wrong with them. And that may look like the case if you do the standard blood tests and whatnot that we're trained to do in residency. But if you do the ones that I do, you'll find that almost all of these children have chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And when you treat it, their symptoms go away or they get much, much better. And the really sad part about this is most children that I've taken care of have both of these going on. And there are many other symptoms too. Next slide, please. The next thing you may ask is, where are all these sick adults? I mentioned 52 million people, 41 million of which are going to be adults. Where are all of these people that are supposedly sick? Well, they have what are called medically unexplained symptoms, like chronic headaches. 10% of the world's population has chronic migraines. 30% of the people in the United States have what's called functional abdominal pain syndrome. Functional means it's all in your head. It means there is no organic problem, just like what we talked about with the children. And then over 10% of the people in the world have chronic fatigue. 1%, so 1/10 of those, have chronic fatigue syndrome. Nobody seems to know what the causes of these illnesses are. And like the children, most of the patients who have these have a combination of these and other things. So we easily can get to the 50 million people that are both being exposed and having illnesses, just with these symptoms that nobody has yet attributed to SIRS. And my experiences in having done lab work on adults is it comes out the same percentage of them, give or take, of the children that have SIRS abnormal lab markers comes out almost the same with the chronic headaches, almost the same for the adults, and the same with the abdominal problems. And I didn't mention chronic fatigue with children, but they have it, same percentage, give or take, we see in the adults. Let's go ahead. And so what my data suggests is that 80% of people that have this combination of headaches, stomach aches, other multi-system illness, they actually have SIRS. And if we treat it early, it's easy to treat. Now, these are some illnesses. I'm going to read through it really, really quickly just so that you hear it as well as read it the same. That these are diagnoses that are made on people that actually have SIRS. And this comes from my own database. I've seen it over and over again. Number one, asthma, ADD and ADHD, sciatica pain, not from your back, but from a neuropathy going on in your body. PMS, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic regional pain syndrome, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, dementia. One author has said that SIRS is type 3 dementia. It's the only kind of Alzheimer's disease that can be reversed. Multiple different kinds of rashes, Lyme disease and the co-infections that are often misdiagnosed with it, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, non-cardiac chest pain, which is another functional problem, lupus, and neuropathic pains, which are always attributed to diabetes. But how do you explain that in somebody who doesn't have diabetes or has only had diabetes for 6 months? And yet it's always attributed to them. Next slide, please. I mentioned this before, but the routine lab test that most doctors, if not all doctors, are trained to do in their medical schools and residencies do not find this illness, which is why they're ignorant of this illness. And yet, we have published more than 20 different biomarkers to help you identify that you have this illness and to actually make the diagnosis. Next slide, please. In the meantime, if you don't get those lab tests done, you get misdiagnosed and mistreated, and there's no hope that you will get better because you're not being treated for the correct illness. Now, the most common presentation of this illness in small children is a single system problem, like chronic headaches or chronic fatigue or recurrent stomach issues or growing pains that have lasted for greater than 2 months. Did you know that when I was in residency, we taught that growing pains were caused by differential growth of bones and tendons and muscles and whatnot? That's not the current state of knowledge. Currently, we have in pediatrics no idea what causes growing pains, but I'll tell you, SIRS does. For older children who are 6 to 10 years old, 5.5 to 10, the same 4 different illnesses I just mentioned show up, but we also see that they have difficulty getting toilet trained by 6 years of age. And when now they're in school age, guess what? They're getting diagnosed with ADD and ADHD because they have a hard time paying attention. And then finally, by the time you hit 11 years old, so 5th or 6th grade, you have multi-system illness. You have illness throughout your body, at least 4 different systems involved. We monitor 9. Usually the average is about 7.5 to 9 of the 9 systems are involved on average with teenagers. Next slide, please. Now, this is a treatment protocol that was developed primarily by Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who's the person who discovered this illness back in 1996. I'm not going to go through it in any depth. I'm going to say, though, if you do step 1, which is get out of your moldy environment, you'll have a lot of improvement. If you do step 2, which is to use a binder, there are wimpy binders like GID. Oh, I probably shouldn't say names, should I? There are some wimpy binders that a lot of treating physicians use. And then there's the one that I use, which is generic cholestyramine. I believe that my patients get better within 2 to 3 months, where using wimpier ways of doing it, they get better in 2 to 3 years. I think it's pretty easy to decide which way you should go. Finally, the last step of this protocol is using intranasal VIP. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that, you know, these patients tend to have low levels of VIP and low levels of MSH. These two chemicals modulate your innate immune system and bring them back down to normal after they've been activated. Most of my patients have low levels of both of these chemicals, so they have no way to bring their immune system back down to normal. And my experience after 13 years is these chemicals rarely come back to normal on their own or even with treatment. So you stay decreased in these along with your HLA predisposition for the rest of your life. And so you can continue to have relapses if you're not careful about the buildings that you go into. But we can supplement now with VIP, and it is a game changer. It can bring you back down to your normal balance, get rid of the inflammation that's going on in your brain. We have actually published 3 studies looking at the inflammation that goes on in your brain using a specialized MRI technique and shown that, number one, if you go through this protocol, you get rid of the swelling in your brain, which is in like half of your brain. Number 2, we can see what the pattern is of this illness from water damaged buildings, and we can distinguish it from the pattern of this illness caused by Lyme disease and from other illnesses like traumatic brain injuries, Parkinson's, et cetera. We have a specific pattern that shows that it's water damaged buildings that led to this. And number 3, VIP can actually turn around or stop the atrophying of areas of your brain. I mean, that's unheard of, guys, that you can take an area of brain that's gotten small, either from neuron death or from neural pruning or dendritic pruning, and you can actually start to reverse that and have it come back toward normal. We're talking about reestablishment of dendrites. And when dendrites touch dendrites, that's what we call learning. Unfortunately, what happens in our patients is their dendrites kind of die and fall off, and that's the opposite of learning. So as Ian was talking about, you know, we want to free their brains to work. We first have to get rid of the inflammation. And for 1/4 of the population, this is a way to do it. Next slide, please. So I want to very quickly give you 3 case studies just to see what we're talking about. And that looks an awful lot like Chin. I don't think it is because I didn't see Chin. The first one is a 3-year-old male. He was 3 years old when I started to see him. At 1 year of age, in fact, the day after his birthday, he started having bloody diarrhea and failure to thrive, which means he couldn't gain weight. In fact, he was losing weight. He was treated by a number of prestigious doctors at some very prestigious medical centers, and nobody could figure out what was wrong with him. And then some family practitioner suggested to him, hey, why don't you try next time you do an endoscopy, why don't you take a biopsy and look for ochratoxin A, toxin that comes from molds, particularly Aspergillus and Penicillium. And they did, and they found a staggering amount of ochratoxin in his bowel. And after that, they started him on treatment. They used some of the more wimpy medicines to treat him. And so I started seeing him 2 years later when he was considerably better and wasn't having the diarrhea and the blood anymore. He was growing better, but he still had some significant cognitive issues. I treated him with my standard treatment of cholestyramine, and within 2 months, his brain had grown. It was coming out of his head. Okay, it wasn't exactly coming out of his head, but he started, to function at a level that he was supposed to. But he also was having, as a 3-year-old, these incredible screaming episodes. Now, you think of terrible 2s and terrible 3s, these kids will scream for 10 or 15 minutes. No. I'm sorry, he was screaming for 3 to 4 hours every single day, nonstop, and sometimes more than once in a day. We started him on some intranasal VIP, and within 2 weeks, his screaming episodes were gone. We treated him with VIP for about a year. We took him off of it. He's now 8 years old, and he's the top of his class. And his behavior, he's the teacher's pet. He is the most compliant child in the class and doing better than all the other kids. That's what treating this illness did. Can I have the next slide? This is a 4-year-old female who actually looks quite a bit like the young lady herself. She was living on the East Coast when a hurricane came by and flooded the family's apartment. And within 6 months, she was in pre-K, and within 6 months, she went from being fairly normal to being actually diagnosed by a neuropsychologist as autistic. Not on the spectrum, but frank autism. That's how poorly functioning she was doing. The mom contacted me a few months later. We gave her 2 months of cholestyramine, and within 2 months, she was back in mainstream class, doing mainstream classwork. And her social skills had come back to normal. She had a little itsy bitsy speech delay, and that was all that was wrong with her. She was reevaluated a few months after that by another neuropsychologist, and they said, she didn't have autism. What? They completely reversed the diagnosis. I mean, is that awesome or what? I'm going to try not to cry here. Anyway, she is doing great 8 years later and doing very well at school. Next slide. And I think you'll be blessed because I believe this is my last slide. Now, this is a 14-year-old female that I took care of as a pediatrician before I knew anything about SIRS or anything like that. Very brilliant parents. Both of them were medical professionals functioning at a very high level. They had 3 children, all functioning at a very high level. When she was 14, she went to a high school that was a known water damaged building. 100,000 square feet of basement and 100,000 square feet of flat roof. It was built as a bomb shelter. It had no ventilation. It was a known water damage building, but nobody in town, me included, understood the problems. So here's a girl who was getting straight A's, taking all honors classes. She was a top tier pianist in both New Mexico and Texas. She was always doing 3 or more dance classes. She was vibrant and alive. And what I saw over her 4 years going to this high school is she went down the swirly bowl. And there was nothing that I could do to figure it out. I had no idea what was wrong with her. I sent her to specialist after specialist. I treated her for depression. I did everything I knew how to do. And nothing. She went off to college. And I should tell you that by the time she graduated, she was getting C's in non-honors classes. And she didn't care. She was so tired, she was no longer playing piano, and she could only take 1 dance class because she loved it so much she couldn't stop. I learned about chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and within the week, I called her and I said, I know what's wrong with you. I had her come back to Roswell. Now she's a sophomore in college. And we treated her. She had to drop out of school for a month because she was so tired and so cognitively impaired. And I can tell you now, that was 13 years ago. Now she has a PhD in nursing practice, and she's a practicing RN, nurse practitioner. And she treats adults and children, and she knows all about SIRS, and she looks for it, and she finds it all the time and treats people successfully. And she may be my greatest success story. So that is my presentation. You may have some questions. I will ask that you hold those to the end, and I pass it over to Jen. Thank you very much.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation this evening. As Dr. McMahon mentioned, I'm Jennifer Constantino. I'm the Executive Director for Brilliant Brain Institute. For those of you that don't know me, I've spent the last 10 years as a school counselor, working directly with students diagnosed with various learning differences and mental health diagnoses. I'd like to start off by sharing some pretty shocking statistics surrounding some of these diagnoses amongst our youth. According to the CDC, autism rates are now 1 in 36 children. And in 2010, it was 1 in 68. 6 million children ages 3 to 17 are diagnosed with ADHD. My son is one of them. 14.5 to 43.5 million children and adults are diagnosed with dyslexia. 31.9% of adolescents aged 13 to 18 are diagnosed with anxiety. Approximately 5.8 million children ages 3 to 17 are diagnosed with anxiety and depression. In 2021, 22% of all high school students seriously considered attempting suicide. 10% actually committed suicide. Personally, I have been involved in many cases, unfortunately, around that. If we all pause for a moment, we'll definitely be able to think about personal situations where these statistics have affected us, either directly or indirectly. So what are we going to do about it? We created a nonprofit that is dedicated to advancing scientific research and health and educational opportunities for children impacted by environmental toxins. Our initial research will uncover correlations between giftedness, specific HLA genes associated with toxin susceptibility, psychological conditions, learning disabilities, and neuroinflammation. The study will serve as the foundation for further exploration impacting brilliance and neurological challenges caused by environmental toxins that we'll do with doctors such as Dr. McMahon. And then eventually we look to partner with the university. This work will serve as the basis of the first ever academic academy grounded in the neuroscience around learning. Goals for 2023. So we would really like to get BBI fully up and running. So this means developing a board, getting our technology and software set up, hiring staff, fundraising for our seed capital, and implementing our marketing plan. We'll also begin the first phase of our first research project. And lastly, by the end of 2023, we will finalize plans for our virtual school, which we look and hope to get started in the 24-25 school year. Our first official research project has 3 goals. The first is to identify if a connection exists between cognitive strengths and weaknesses and those predisposed to susceptible HLA DRDQ genes. The second is to identify if those with one or more of the genes are experiencing neuroinflammation. And the third is to identify what correlations exist between cognitive giftedness, the HLA gene, and neuroinflammation. As I mentioned, our goal is to lay the groundwork to identify further research that needs to be conducted in the realm and to ultimately partner with the university to carry out further, more detailed research. BBI we want to use this as a vehicle for change. Whistleblower, bring the information to light. We want to make a difference. Virtual school. I know there's a ton of virtual schools out there, but ours is definitely going to be different. It's going to act as a safe space for students, a place where they can experience one-on-one teaching, an environment safe from toxins, a place where students have the ability to unlock their brilliance and develop a passion for authentic learning. Our virtual school will be based on the latest in neuroscience and will continually evolve, based on our ongoing research. We are currently seeking seed donations to help reach our 2023 goals. This money will be used to purchase the tests needed for our research, as well as administrative and operational costs. And we will also need the seed money to get our technology set up. Thank you all so much for attending this presentation tonight. We'd like to now open up, to any questions that you might have for myself, for Ian, for Dr. McMahon. Please let us know what questions you might have.
Thanks again, everybody. Yeah, excited for questions. Thank you, Dr. McMahon, for being here. Thank you, Jen. Thank everybody. I just want to thank everybody for being here. It means a lot. It's a huge gift to us. So yeah, please bring on the questions. I'm assuming 100% of them are going at Dr. McMahon, but we're happy to field anything. I think Wendy had mentioned a couple questions. Dr. McMahon, she was asking about the SpectraCell blood work and thoughts on heavy metals. That's what her two questions were. You may be muted. Yeah.
So there's some controversy in medicine, and it depends on whether you're talking to the standard Western trained medicine doctor or somebody who is more in functional medicine or integrated medicine. There are different ways of measuring heavy metals, for instance, and amongst those different groups, there are different thresholds for treatment and different types of treatment. So amongst Western medicine, we rarely find these kind of toxicities, and we rarely treat them, and so we just kind of push them off to the side. In the same way that most Western medicine doctors just push mold off to the side and don't think that it can actually cause any serious problems. But amongst the people that are looking at a different way of treating people and looking at actual root causes and whatnot, they'll often find toxicities from mercury or cadmium or other heavy metals, and we'll treat that, and it's just a part of the total body toxin burden reduction approach that they take.
I'm sure there are a couple more questions. Anyone wants to brave one? Okay. All right. Well, we must have explained things really well. I guess,
Sorry,
our students
I have a question, Ian. This is
Yeah.
Lynn.
Hey, Lynn.
I was trying to get off mute. Thank you, all three of you, for that presentation. I had a question about whether or not any of you have done any particular studies of folks that live in poverty as opposed to folks who don't, and whether or not the sort of environmental, whether it's mold or something else, whether the environmental toxins, the indoor environmental toxins, have a greater impact on those folks than those of us who don't live in poverty. And if you haven't looked at it, whether anybody, I mean, I know a lot of folks have, but specifically with respect to your research.
I take it that question is coming to me. There have been studies looking at things like lead poisoning and heavy metals that show that people that are living in poverty, people living in older housing, certainly ones that had interior painting before lead was banned from paints in the 70s, they definitely have an increase in cognitive problems and whatnot. As far as mold, here's the really sly thing about it. Mold affects everybody. There's so many different ways. I mean, I live in the desert. I thought, nobody gets mold in the desert. No, I think about 700 of my patients are from the city that I live in, because mold is everywhere. We have flat roofs, for instance, and flat roofs leak. And even though we don't get much rainfall, it still trickles through and it creates a mold problem. People who have basements, people who have crawl spaces, and it doesn't matter how expensive the house is or whatnot, you can get mold. And so it really can affect everybody. Are people who live in poverty, who are living in slumlord kind of dwellings more likely to? For sure. But it really can affect everybody. And it's a nationwide crisis that many people are kind of just trying not to look at.
I would follow up with that, Lynn, by saying I refuse to walk into pretty much any house in Roland Park. Period. Full stop. First of all that, and to answer your question directly, based on the experience of kind of low-income students that we see, the most brilliant students, the ones with most cognitive potential, consistently, I'm telling you, research will show this, are in the worst shape if they're impoverished. They're the ones who have so much cognitive distress because of the environments that they live in and their vulnerabilities that are implicit to having these genes, that they're the ones who just can't sit still in class. They're the ones that teach. They're not the teacher's pets coming from low-income backgrounds. The smartest kids are the opposite of that. So that's the really tragic reality about it, is that, the people with the most cognitive potential have the hardest time getting out of impoverished situations. And yet, I would say, like Dr. McMahon says, based on my experience of students, there is equality. It's neurological equality in all the wrong ways across the wealthiest students and the lowest income students. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. A lot of times, wealthier students have parents and grandparents and all that are pre-built with a lot. These parents all went to the same school, spaced repetition. So it's not that cognitively taxing to just knock out school. Now, if your parents were not that, then it is cognitively taxing to do that. It requires real learning. Well, what I noticed is a lot of kids get away with just proving what they already know, what they were pre-built with, and judge themselves within that framework. You know, so it's just, I just want to just, again, go back to what I'm saying about, this presentation is going to cause you. Focus on what's in your conscious reality. Prove us wrong. That's what's going to happen. I just want to point that out. It's what I did for years. So just so we're clear here, that's the same as when a kid jumps on a wrong answer on the SAT. They're like, this is what I'm more familiar with, not taking the time. So just, and especially if you have this disease, it's called scapegoating. You're like, it's not learning. It's like, whatever the first thing I think it should be, the solution fits into my conscious reality. That's it. Just trying to describe the psychology to a T because I'm right here. I know it.
I'd like to follow up on that too. Based on my professional experience I used to work at the Department of Child Safety. So I was first in to remove children from homes that were unsafe, unfit. Those children tended to go on to be diagnosed with ODD, ADHD, learning differences all across the board. And it used to be, my old way of thinking was that this has to do with the lack of parental guidance, all that stuff. I'm sure those are huge factors in it. But knowing what I know now, I absolutely feel that those environments that they were in play a huge role in this. And our goal in BBI is to absolutely research the correlation between those and really work with all children across the board. But definitely we want to make sure that we're supporting those from impoverished situations.
And if I might add, those children are not only likely getting a mold exposure at home, they're also getting one at school. So basically 24/7, they're being exposed.
Thank you.
Any more questions we can answer before we close down for night? Get everyone in bed. It's past my bedtime almost, so. Thank you guys again. I'm sure there might be, individualized questions you might want to ask without kind of the other people around. So I'm happy to answer that. I'm really passionate about this. I hope you guys can tell. And I'm not trying to project anything. I just, it's something that is a reality that I think we need to be paying attention to. And it would sure help me a lot, helping get these kids bigger SAT scores a lot faster, because that's what I see happening as a result. So I appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening. I know this is kind of going outside of what you already know. So it's a learning experience. It's a big thing. So thank you. It's a big deal. That's what I like. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you,
Dr. McMahon. We really appreciate our work here. So thank you guys.